So how did all this happen? Well, the phenomenon in the ancient world that you read about is the idea of hostage astrologers. The vanquishing king came in and conquered an enemy kingdom. The first thing they would do is round up all of the occult scholars and wine them and dine them and try to bring them into the vanquishing entourage of the king or queen. So we see it with Daniel. He's an astrologer magician taken hostage. He rises up to become the supervisor of all the Babylonian astrologers and diviners. And that's, if you don't trust me, just look at the book of Daniel, chapter 5, verse 11. Pliny the Elder said something really interesting. Slaves on sale that had been imported from overseas, instance of these being Plubius of Antioch, the founder of our mimic stage, and his cousin Manilius Antiochus, the originator of our astronomy. And remember, astronomy and astrology are the same word. They're used interchangeably until the 6th century AD. Xenodotus of Malus writes that Homer was a Babylonian. And the reason that that's so intriguing is the name Homer literally means hostage. He twice describes, Homer, by the way, describes seagoing Phoenician slave traders interacting with Greeks in the Iliad. And in the Homeric hymns, he recounts how the god Dionysius was taken by pirates as booty while walking on the beach. The goal was to sell the god Dionysius for a ransom and get a lot of money for him. So there's an archaeologist actually locally, his name's Bradley Parker, is at the University of Utah. He wrote an article, I guess maybe 10 years ago, in the Near Eastern Bulletin. It's really fascinating. He recounts how Greek seafarers, they encounter, they're basically traveling to Phoenician ports. They're traveling by sea, and they're raiding the beaches and the seaports of Assyrian-controlled Phoenicia, and they're trying to take as much booty as possible, and that included slaves. And they weren't this big, gigantic force sent by some reigning king in the Greek homeland. They were literally just a couple of boats show up. They raided. They tried to take as much booty as possible, including slaves, and then they got into their boats and disappeared into the middle of the ocean once the Assyrian army showed up. So they weren't in any way able to go head to head with the Assyrian army. However, on 3 different occasions, the reigning governor of that seaport is reporting this to the Assyrian king. So this is coming up a lot. It's a problem. If he's reporting it to the Assyrian king, they're showing up all the time. This is a real nuisance. It's what, we would think of it today as just, raids for booty. Think of, I don't know. I think of, because we have issues with because we have a southern border with Mexico. There's drug cartels on the border. It's something like that. Like you're dealing with people that are taking human beings and selling them on a slave market. So the goal of these Greek pirates raids was to get as much booty as possible, and of course that included slaves. So Lucian in the 2nd century has this remarkable mock interview with Homer, and he says, Lucian's talking to Homer. He's got this, of course he's living 900 years after Homer or longer, right? And he says, above all, where do you come from? And Homer responds, as a matter of fact, I'm a Babylonian, and among my fellow countrymen, my name was not Homer or hostage, but Tigranes. Later on, when I was a hostage among the Greeks, I changed my name. So it's this kind of idea that Homer's not a real guy. It's an eponymous title for what happened in the ancient world right about Homer's time. This maybe some Babylonian was taken hostage, taken into the Greek homeland, shared the idea, the knowledge of his knowledge of the cuneiform constellation titles, and the idea that the stars are heavenly writing that divulge revelations to astrologers that can decipher their puns. M.L. West, who's a world-class scholar, classical scholar, he says that Homer is not the name of a historical poet, but a fictitious or constructed name. There was no original Homer, but the Hammurabi were not named after a person, but not knowing any better, they invented the Hammurabi based on an ancestor or a founder. I don't like the term not knowing any better. I think it was entirely intentional. They named Homer Hostage because he's a Babylonian astrologer who was taken hostage. And he taught them how to read the night sky as a text and create indigenous Greek celestial mythology, Greek accounts of what we would today call scripture. He also goes on to say, how was the influence transmitted from one poetic tradition to another? And he says, I see no alternative to the assumption of a certain number of bilingual poets, probably Easterners, who had settled in Greece and learned to compose epic in the Greek manner. In other instances, we seem to detect close relationships between Homeric and Hesiodic passages and other classic Babylonian texts, such as Archaeologist, which is the first flood story, and Enuma-Elish, which is the Babylonian creation story, including Tablet 7 that's comprised entirely from epiphanies derived from wordplay. And then he goes on to say, to account for them, we must surely postulate poets educated in the Levant, in the East, maybe Mesopotamia, maybe Phoenicia, who subsequently became Hellenized and practiced in Greece. So one last thing, just to hammer home the idea, Walter Burkett is another, just one of the greatest scholars that has ever existed. He's actually friends with the professor that taught me Akkadian, but Akkadian cuneiform side by side with Aramaic, Phoenician, and Greek alphabetic script produces a continuum of written culture in the 8th century BC, which stretches from the Euphrates to Italy. Cuneiform tablets are found not only as far as Syria, but also on Cyprus and Tarsus, where the Greeks were definitely present, which proves that Greek literary practice is ultimately dependent upon Mesopotamia. So you don't have to believe me when I say it, but if Walter Burkert says it, you might want to believe him, because he is probably the greatest classicist of all times. So we can take some information from this. Archaeological textual record document direct contact between Mesopotamian and Greek scholars throughout the 8th century BC. The ancient record implies that Babylonian astrologers, or writers, had been taken hostage, or Homer, by a Hellenic satrap. And the last piece is Lucian claims that a vestige of the slave-taking encounter remains in the eponymous title of the father of Greek epic poetry, Homer, Hostage. So that's the evidence that I'm presenting to say Hesiod knew how to read the celestial writing of the night sky as if he were a Babylonian, or one of his tutors knew it. Maybe he didn't, but he was working with a tutor who did.